All right, in this video, I'll be mainly focusing on how we show positive and negative externalities inside of the supply and demand framework, similar to the way we did with taxes and price controls before that. It's important for us to think about these various economic concepts for both their conceptual and theoretical ideas, sort of what we think they do to markets and what we perceive them to do to markets. But it's also important for us to do this from a technical perspective and actually be able to show the theory inside of some illustrative point. Of course, our most used and often used in this particular class is supply and demand, and so let's talk about that from this context. Externalities are market failures, similar to information asymmetries, which we've previously discussed, and similar to market power, which we'll discuss in the future. Externalities are a source of social inefficiency because markets fail to maximize social efficiency. Negative externalities refer to markets that create marginal external damage. This is damage that goes outside of the market and does not make it back into the market to inform decisions. Basic examples of these are steel refineries, which dump mercury, coal-powered electricity, which produces particulate matter pollution. And the basic idea is that these are sources of environmental damage, sources of pollution, which are being caused from markets which are generating their own economic benefit. And so the economic benefit that's being generated inside these markets is not accounting for the damage that's being created outside of them. As a result, the prices that are set in these particular markets are not their true social cost. And therefore, this is why we refer to them as market failures. Positive externalities refer to markets which create marginal external benefit. So this is sort of the opposite of damage flowing outside of markets. Examples of this would be flu shots. If I get my flu shot, it doesn't matter if someone who I simply happen to be close to gets a flu shot or not, that person benefits from my flu shot. So it's a situation where the decision that I make to get a flu shot creates a benefit that is felt outside of the particular market. I get my own personal benefit, but of course I paid for the flu shot. But me getting the flu shot also creates a benefit for someone else, regardless of whether they get the flu shot. Positive externalities are very similar to a concept that we'll talk about in the near future called public goods. The whole point here is that externalities get in the way of our efficient price setting process inside of markets. We've learned previously that our expectation is that markets will set what we call efficient competitive prices, and that this will be what creates the highest efficiency get relative to, say, the government deciding how much should be purchased and how much should be consumed, or the government price controlling. If we allow markets to equilibrate on their own, this theoretically is supposed to create the most preferred outcome. We, of course, refer to this as the first fundamental welfare theorem, which posits that competitive markets maximize efficiency. In the context of externalities, either positive or negative externalities, the idea is that since there are these costs or benefits which are flowing outside of the market, then the prices that are being set inside of the market are not their true social value. Therefore, the prices are socially inefficient, and the outcomes produced by these markets are also socially inefficient. So now let's look at these in a graphical perspective. So we have our typical market equilibrium, which equilibrates here at Q star and P star. We refer to this as the private market outcome because this is the outcome that the market is going to equilibrate to on its own, thus the private market outcome. We also may refer to this as the competitive market outcome. Now, the first fundamental welfare theorem tells us that this outcome is economically efficient, and in some sense this would imply that we could do no better than Q star and P star. And of course this is what those who advocate for so-called free markets often argue, that because supply and demand theory tells us that market equilibration is the most efficient, therefore competitive free markets are the most efficient. But of course externalities cause problems with this line of thinking. Now, if you'll recall, we referred to what is created with respect to a negative externality as marginal external damage. What we'll refer to it here is just marginal damage. So let's imagine that this is created on the supply side. What we mean is that the producer or producers in this market are where the externality or where the damage is coming from. A good example of this, again, is our steel refinery, which takes iron ore and turns it into steel, and in the process creates a bunch of mercury, and the steel plant has to dispose of this mercury in some way. And unfortunately and historically, plants have just used waterways as a means to get rid of the mercury, and so you can sort of see that the idea is that once it's in the waterway, the steel refinery doesn't have to worry about it anymore. It's sort of a literal, externality. Anyway, so we want to show this marginal damage inside of the market. We want to show it inside the market so we can talk about what it means for the market. So the way we do this is similar to the way we talked about taxes, we're going to envision a second supply curve. This is we're going to refer to as the social supply curve. The social supply curve is simply the initial supply curve, what we call the private supply curve, which is just S, and we take the damage that's being created by the production of the product. Remember, this is a negative production externality. So we take the damage, the marginal damage that's being created by this production, and what we do is we just add it to marginal damage. So we take this initial supply curve, we add marginal damage, and it shifts the supply curve up by the amount of marginal damage. And so all the social supply curve is the private supply curve shifted up by the amount of marginal damage. Now, when this occurs, we see that there is a new equilibrium. We're going to refer to this equilibrium as the socially efficient equilibrium. The reason why we call this the socially efficient equilibrium is that this is the equilibrium which recognizes the negative externality. What we've done here is we're putting the damage into the market. Remember, this is an externality. Normally the market doesn't see this damage. What we're doing is we're putting the damage into the market. And if we put the damage into the market, this says that instead of Q star, the socially efficient quantity is QEFF here, so less quantity. And instead of the market equilibrium P star, the socially efficient price is PEFF. Notice it's more expensive. This says that under the private market, in the presence of a negative externality, we overconsume the good relative to social efficiency. Q star is greater than QEFF, so the private market overproduces and consumes the good, and we pay too low a price for it. The basic idea is that if this is a good that's creating damage outside of the market, but I'm only paying P star for the good, this means that I'm not paying for any of the additional damage that's being created by the good. Therefore, a price of P star is inefficiently low with respect to society. And so social efficiency would mean that I pay a higher price and I consume less of the good. Now, we can see this a little bit clearer if we add a little bit more detail to the graph. Now, you'll notice that there is this additional level of economic activity that occurs under the private market equilibrium than under social efficiency, Q star versus QEFF. What this means is that the private market actually creates deadweight loss. Recall up to this point, we've said that deadweight loss is created whenever we're off of equilibrium positions. So anytime we were not at P star or not at Q star, this means there was deadweight loss. But in this scenario, remember, we're saying that the private market, in fact, is inefficient. Therefore, this deadweight loss only occurs when the market is at Q star and P star. If we can somehow get the market to operate at the socially efficient point, then this deadweight loss, in fact, goes away. Sometimes students get a little confused because they're used to deadweight loss only appearing whenever we have a price control or we have a tax or subsidy. Here, again, the deadweight loss appears under the private market equilibrium. It appears at P star and Q star. Under the socially efficient equilibrium of PEFF and QEFF, there is no deadweight loss, and we've reached social efficiency. Now, the other form of negative externality is a negative consumption externality. This means that the damage is coming from consumers. Again, we can show this easily in supply and demand, and this is just a downward shift of the demand curve. Again, what we want to do is recognize the damage that's being created by the consumption of the good. What this does is, like it did before, it establishes a point of social efficiency. And again, the social efficiency is at a lower quantity and at a higher price, reflecting the fact that when consumers only pay P star, they're not paying for the marginal damage they're creating under the private market equilibrium, whereas the socially efficient equilibrium takes into account this marginal damage. And as before, we can add a little bit more detail to fully understand this. We see that under the private market equilibrium, once again, there's deadweight loss. So regardless of where the negative externality comes from, on the consumption side or on the production side, the result is that the private market equilibrium is inefficient, producing deadweight loss. The socially efficient equilibrium, on the other hand, is efficient and produces no deadweight loss. We also have positive externalities. These are markets, which we previously discussed, in which there is marginal benefit being created outside of the market. Let's imagine that this is occurring because of the production of a product. One good example of this that I can think of is that when I lived in Grand Rapids, Michigan, I lived fairly close to a bakery. And this bakery, aside from, of course, having bread that I could purchase, also smelled wonderful. So you didn't even have to buy the bread. You could simply walk by the bakery and you got to enjoy, in some sense, the bread being baked. It was, in its purest sense, a positive externality. So, in order to show this, unsurprisingly, we're going to show a social supply curve, which again is simply the private supply curve, but recognizes the externality. Here, that externality, again, is marginal benefit. And so we show this by shifting the supply curve out or increasing it by the amount of marginal damage. When we do this, as before, this creates the socially efficient outcome. Here we should notice that the socially efficient quantity is greater than the private market outcome, and that the socially efficient price is less than the private market outcome. Again, the private market is inefficient. Social efficiency would dictate that in the presence of a positive externality, we should in fact pay less for the product and consume more of it. A good example of this is flu shots. The production of flu shots certainly creates immense positive externalities, and therefore the prices that we pay for flu shots should actually be lower, and we should consume more of them. Once again, the private market creates deadweight loss here relative to the fact that it does not recognize the marginal benefit of the positive externality. Finally, a positive consumption externality can be shown by outwardly shifting the demand curve to the social demand curve by the amount of marginal benefit. This creates the socially efficient point, which again shows that the socially efficient quantity is greater than the private market quantity, and the socially efficient price is less than the private market price. Again, under the positive consumption externality, the private market produces deadweight loss, whereas the socially efficient outcome produces no deadweight loss. Finally, how may we think about externalities in the context of policy responses? Well, there are two types of policy responses toward externalities. So-called command and control, in which government mandates for a specific standard or for outright banning in the context of negative externalities. Examples of command and control would be CAF standards, or corporate average fuel efficiency standards, clean power plant rules. Other policies that, with respect to, say, positive externalities, would be the fact that the government requires that school children be publicly educated. This acknowledges the fact that public education is an immense positive externality, and so by requiring children to be publicly educated, the government is in fact mandating education. And so again, this is a legal perimeter in which the government enforces a particular standard. The EPA, of course, is an important process within the construction of environmental policy in the U.S., And much of the policies that the Environmental Protection Agency has used over the years would be considered command and control policy. Otherwise, there are what we call market-based mechanisms. Here, the government uses things like taxes or subsidies in order to achieve some socially efficient outcome. If we want to reduce the activity in a market because it creates damage, then we tax it. If we want to increase the activity in a market because it creates benefit, then we subsidize it. There are other forms of market-based mechanisms like cap and trade and other forms of market-based policy mechanisms in which private individuals can engage in transactions to voluntarily reduce pollution. However, there are certain types of pollutants for which market-based mechanisms aren't necessarily the most preferred outcome. Types of market-based mechanisms you may have come across: cigarette taxes, carbon taxes, and of course other forms of market-based mechanisms like cap and trade programs provide governments a way to induce greater environmental protection without necessarily having to decide on particular standards or mandates. But still, for especially damaging pollutants like lead and mercury, for example, history tells us that market-based mechanisms and the way that they reduce the incentives to consume products, which would perhaps create pollutants, that there are certain types of pollutants that are so damaging that simply incentivizing the reduction of their usage probably doesn't go far enough. And so there's this balance. There are some pollutants for which command and control policy is preferred, and there are other pollutants for which market-based mechanisms would be preferred. A really good example of this is CO2, carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is not hazardous to human health, mostly because it moves up into our upper atmosphere. However, a high concentration of carbon dioxide in the upper atmosphere has proven to be climatic destabilizing, meaning that it in fact has changed the natural climatic motions in our environment and require us to now rethink where we live and how we grow food and how we're going to find water and other types of resources in the future. And so CO2 presents a more long-run problem as opposed to necessarily a short-run problem. And so therefore, it's an especially good pollutant for a market-based system in which over time your goal is to reduce the incentives to produce and consume carbon dioxide emitting products.